Our next speaker is Terry Foxx, who will address Out of the Ashes. Terry.
Thank you very much. I'd like you to take a moment and think about something you've seen on the media related to fire. Say the California fires, like Paradise, California, or maybe one of the Idaho fires. Those images are what create your perception. Perception is one of those things that helps us. Perception is one of those things that helps us in our attitudes, both good and bad. It's the way we think, and a lot of people think very differently, right? But perception is not reality. Perception is not reality. Reality is the search for truth. In 1975, I was given the opportunity to do a study in Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico. Bandelier is in the northern part of New Mexico. It's a series of mesas and canyons, and it has ponderosa pine at higher elevations, pinyon juniper at lower elevations. Now, the people that managed the park were interested in whether or not the park could help make the forest sustainable because there had been over 60 years of fire suppression. So our goal was to find out what the fire interval had been before the fire suppression and after. But beyond that, what we had found was that since 1890, when the mesas started to be populated and there were domestic animals grazing, that there hadn't been any large fire for almost 80 years. I loved hiking those trails, going up and down those canyons, the big pines that shaded me, and also the trees, the big ponderosas, the smell of them. But when it came to the talk of wildfire, even though I'd been hired to do this study, I had a very negative view. My view was that all fire was bad, and it affected the way I lived my life. It affected also how I did my science. My study that we were involved in, let me go back. I was raised in southern Idaho in the 1940s and 50s. And my father had been part of the logging industry, and trees were to be cut, not burned. The other thing that happened in the 40s was a movie came out, and it was one of the first animated movies, and it was called Bambi. And fire was depicted as bad when Bambi's father was racing away from the fire and, of course, died. And for a child, the one poster I saw that gave my heart great grief was one of Smokey holding Bambi, and it said, "Our most shameful waste. Only you can prevent forest fires." With that background and the fact that at that time, the organizational cry of the Forest Service was to stop all fires by 10 o'clock the next morning, my generation and many generations looked at fire as being evil. Our study, as we processed on, found that prior to fire suppression, there had been a fire in the forest every 5 to 10 years. But after fire suppression, there had not been a fire for many years, 60 years, in fact. Because fire suppression started in about 1910. all because of a fire in northern Idaho called the Big Blow Up that happened in 1910. The Forest Service was an infant, and their perception was all fire was bad and it had to be stopped. And so they put this rule, this 10-hour rule, on immediately, that all fire had to be stopped by 10 o'clock the next day. Certainly, in our study, a lot of our plots or a lot of our study areas were only 10 acres because of that. We'd just about finished our study when it happened. 80 years, there'd been no fire, a wildfire. I had been out that day in Bandelier, and when I got home, I looked back, and from the monument came a plume of amber smoke. If you've ever seen a wildfire, the smoke is amber. The sun shining through it. Ash was flying into the street in front of me. And my heart sank. And all those childhood memories of Bambi and his father running from that fire. Fire, my understanding was all fire was evil. My heart sank. 2 years of work down the... What was I going to do? Would I write it up? For that fire was called the La Mesa Fire, and it burned over 15,000 acres and 11 of my 12 study areas. Little did I know it was really the beginning of the beginning for me. About 7 days after that fire went through that forest, I was allowed to go back out to my study areas. And what I saw that morning changed my perception. And I'd like to read to you what I wrote. An early morning walk along trails once familiar, trees dark shadows before the breaking dawn. They stand like ghostly sentinels to what was and will be. In the silence before the sun rose, darkness fell upon my deep sorrow. My sense of place was lost. The sun rose, sprinkling early morning light on blackened landscapes. As the sun rays reached the inky dust, I stood in wonder. Dark ash. Won't change. Well, you'll have to imagine it. Dark ash, sunlit sprouts, emerald grass. To my astonishment,
Keep going. Yeah, it's frozen.
so much for slides. So your imagination has to be very vivid here. Okay, dark ash, sunlit sprouts, emerald grass. To my astonishment, new life rises from the ashes. Weeks later, I saw lizards scurrying, ants marching, woodpeckers drumming, flowers adding color. All was not dead and lost. In those moments, I had a revelation. Each ash upon my shoe, each blackened trunk and stone are but a message of hope. Here too I begin again. Life will rise and rise and rise again. Fire was not the enemy, but a great regenerating force of nature. Since that fire in 1977, we've had many other fires in our area, each one larger. Because of fire suppression, the fuel loads were so heavy. But in the year 2000, our community of Los Alamos was struck by a wildfire that came down off the tree-covered mountain. It burned into the community, and it burned houses. The media said it was a disaster. They showed the same home burning over and over and over, and fire-blackened firefighters fighting to defend homes, and all of us being evacuated. And when the community came back, they came back in deep sorrow. Sorrow was prevalent everywhere, even if you lost a home or not. The reason was that we had a mountain that had once been treed, was now treeless and blackened. And when we would look at it from a distance, all we would see was the blackness. The grief was shown by the stories that were told, stories of survival, stories of help, stories of evacuation. But when we would go out into that forest, once forest, and stand there, what we would see was new life rising from those ashes. And I had a revelation that not only was the grief because people lost homes, but we had all lost something. We had lost our landscape. And your landscape is part of you. And when you lose your landscape, you lose part of you, and you will and must grieve. I gave talk after talk, walk after walk, to bring people into that burned forest so they could see what I saw, the new life rising from the ashes. And gradually the community began to believe more in the fact that nature heals. No matter how difficult or how hot the fire is, nature heals. As human beings, we want all change to stop. We want fire to stop, floods to stop, hurricanes to stop, but that's not what nature does. Nature heals, regardless of what happens. We call it a disaster when change happens, and it happens quickly. We call it a disaster because of the human loss and the human toil and all the resources that are lost. But for nature, it just is. It's part of the cycle of life and death and life again. Wildfire is inevitable. If you live in a prone environment, you will eventually have a fire. But I know one thing that I've learned over all the years that I studied fire and studied disaster, that new life will rise from the ashes. And I have assurance now in my own life that new life will rise from the ashes of our own lives. In closing, I'd like to read a little bit about what I said that long time ago. I was struck with awe and wonder at the resilience and rebounding of creation, and filled with gratitude to the holy. The flash of green light amidst the ashes was a teacher to me. And I threw away my old perception and well-trodden ideas. Instead, I embrace the wild and uncontrolled nature of nature and welcomed her as she is and all her mysteries. Thank you. I'm sorry the slides didn't work because you would have not had to imagine, but hopefully you imagined, so thank you.